heart is pounding, but Paimon's
Paimon, arguably the most, or at least one of the most iconic characters for Genshin Impact. She's even the game's logo. She's been with us since the very start of this game as the fourth character you meet, with the first and second being the two twins and the third being the sustainer of heavenly principles. Yet she has the most lines out of any character in-game. However, she's arguably one of the most hated or at least most disliked units, despite having all those voice lines, despite appearing in pretty much every form of promotion the game has. Nobody really seems to like her, and I kind of want to do a deep dive into this character and really discuss how and what she's supposed to do. Because I do believe for any individual who maybe has played the game for a year or 2 years or maybe even 3 since launch, if you were to start a fresh account on a different server and experience the game from the beginning, Paimon was a different character. She was and did have a different voice, but the voice was never the problem. I think it only became more grating over time, sure, but I don't think that's the core of her problem and issues as a character in game. So I want to talk about Paimon, but I also want to talk about the main character themselves, because I believe it's impossible to talk about one without at least mentioning the other. So let's talk about the issues people have with her as a character. I think Paimon has become such a talking point in the community because originally she was meant to be our guide. That's how Paimon was introduced and marketed to us as a guide, as someone who is more knowledgeable than the Traveler on how Teyvat itself worked. One of the first things she showed us was the animal statue of Barbados. And that set the expectation that this would be a character who introduces new concepts to you, but over time as you got acclimated to the world around you, you wouldn't hear as much of these tips from her because you wouldn't know what they meant. She commented when you received the power of Geo, but ultimately that was it. That should have been it, because after you arrived at the Statue of the Seven in Liyue, you had already established that at this point at least you could use multiple elements, so it wouldn't be a surprise to use Electro or Dendra. But Paimon shifted. If you go back to Mondstadt, and if you go back to even part of Liyue, she became much less of a guide and much more of a voice. A lot of individuals like to use the theory that the Traveler can't speak because they don't understand the language of Teyvat. However, as the story has gone on, this has been entirely disproven. The Traveler has spoken. The Traveler responds in dialogue. The options you choose are technically the Traveler speaking. They've been in Teyvat for more than 500 years. And whilst there is no direct time frame from when we woke up on the beach to when we actually met Paimon or started our journey, there does mean to a degree that Traveler themselves have at least been in Teyvat, enough to learn some degree of language. So the concept that the Traveler and Paimon are two in the same because Paimon has to be a voice doesn't really work anymore, because Paimon isn't a voice. Paimon doesn't state what the Traveler is thinking. Paimon doesn't state what the Traveler should say. Paimon states the obvious too. Paimon went from being your guide to the innocent child on their journey, and that is a very different line to cross. Because Paimon doesn't provide any benefits, but you actively don't choose when to be around Paimon. She butts in a lot of times in emotional situations, and these aren't emotional situations where she makes sense to be in. A lot of times, if you're looking back to the Legend, for an example, the situations she gets involved in when she interrupts are usually either for comedic relief or because the situation is too serious. Yunjin and Shenhe were having a conversation about her past, and ultimately it was supposed to be a very deep and sentimental moment between them two, but Paimon interrupts to say, hurry up, essentially. Paimon never endears herself as a good character or a good person. Paimon wants food. Paimon wants to protect the Traveler, but to what degree and to what extent? And we know nothing about this unit other than the fact that they want to be around us constantly. And there is a difference, because every other character has a story, has hopes, dreams, friends, and ideals, as well as a backstory and past. Paimon doesn't, and as much as people might say that's intriguing because it means there's something special, it doesn't endear us to her. Paimon isn't a character. She's a caricature of the Traveler. She speaks and states the obvious in case you haven't realized it already. Oh hey, you're lost? Paimon's gonna say it. As opposed to you losing Paimon. Paimon could have, and realistically should have been used as a consistent character that eventually gets pulled back once you get adjusted to the world around you, but stays consistent enough to keep you locked or to some degree drawn into Teyvat's lore. Instead, they could have done a situation in which she's a consistent companion. She doesn't say the obvious, but instead she interjects into statements you'd otherwise say. If you're saying something, she pops in with her own opinions, and it gives a much more back and forth feeling of a friend rather than a voice. And if you're going down that route, you also could have had a situation in which to raise stakes and to raise tension, she could have either been harmed or could have actually done something. Paimon has never, objectively speaking, done anything, at least to my knowledge and memory, for any character in the lore or the game. She acts as your guide. You can say she cares for the Traveler, but that doesn't really mean anything when Genshin itself builds characters around the concept of liking the Traveler. I mean, even if we're considering the worst characters in the game thus far that are playable, they have to like the Traveler. They have to at least be nice to them. Wanderer or Scaramouche is nice to the Traveler now. Child is perfectly fine with the Traveler and is quite friendly with them. Raiden and Yaimiko had their characters molded and entirely shifted so that way they could be friendly with the Traveler. Xiao's character makes no sense when you take into consideration the Traveler because he's standoffish, but apparently he's just gonna make exceptions every 5 seconds for you, the Traveler. So Paimon caring for the Traveler means ultimately nothing when she's a character that has no impact in the story and for a lot of players has no impact itself. If you like and enjoy the deeper and more sentimental moments of the game, the issue you're running into a lot of those times with these moments is that this character will come in out of nowhere or come in the entire time and talk and talk and talk in paragraphs of dialogue that ultimately do not further the plot nor serve any purpose than to state what is already occurring. Yes, I get that she may ask questions that the reader may have or that the audience may have, but the issue is that the questions she asks could be asked by the Traveler directly, or how it unnecessarily bloats dialogue options and dialogue scenarios. If the Traveler asks something about Conria, Paimon will say, "Oh yeah, we forgot to ask about that," rather than the character just answering. It's unnecessary padding that makes quests feel longer and also makes them feel overall less impactful because you remember the situations when Paimon's not an active player. If you played through Inazuma's questline, you remember the time Yaimiko was involved directly with the Traveler and Raiden in comparison to the times Paimon was there. Because every other character in that instance has agency. They have their own purpose, they have their own goals separate from you a lot of times, and ultimately they are a separate person entirely. Paimon never feels enough like a separate entity to feel like someone who matters. She is, in pretty much every sense of the word, the Traveler. A copy, a voice, and whatever the plot needs her to be in the moment. And as the game's mascot, she's not put in danger. She's not put in situations where she can actually be harmed, and she never is put in a situation where she's reprimanded. She's rewarded as the companion who's always by your side, always talked positively about, always there to help you, always there to guide you, and rewarded with food constantly. But how many of you actually enjoy her company? How many of you can actually list off traits about her aside from the food thing? How many of you legitimately would be happier with her continuing to follow along with you rather than being separated from you? And do you think of her as a separate entity from the Traveler or as the exact same? She's spoken about so much because she is basically the main character. The Traveler themselves is kind of just there along for the ride, but realistically they don't have their own voice. And this is only further been amplified by the higher pitch that the voice actor has taken. I dislike Paimon because ultimately the voice itself doesn't lend itself to serious moments. It's too high pitched for her to ever sound serious. It just sounds like it's a weird Disney Junior cartoon. I want to like her. I think that if HoYoverse put the effort in to make Paimon a not necessarily significant character, but a character that has more impact by taking her away. If you gave us quiet quest moments with the Archons, with the Adepti, with the main plot, with Alhaitham, Cyno, Tignari, with no Paimon, that would mean that every scene she's in thereafter is more impactful. The less we have, the more they matter. But she is so oftentimes shown to us, she's overused to a point to where it is now feeling pointless. And despite being used so constantly, despite being overused in pretty much every aspect, she is so underutilized as an actual plot point or story point. And yes, everyone could say she could be a big reveal as like the god of time. It doesn't matter though, because nothing has really been alluded to in this instance. And if that is the case, there needs to be something that really makes us attached to this character, because they can't make her this big powerful entity that still shares the exact same traits as the same Paimon we traveled with, because it doesn't fit. And if they do a 180 where she becomes evil, it doesn't fit. She isn't a character who has her own traits, who hopes, dreams, and goals. She is just a flying companion for the Traveler that does whatever the Traveler does. And it is because of that she can't necessarily be used in any major plot points. She has to develop into a separate entity from the Traveler first before being able to enact on any big emotional or important journeys in the story. Otherwise, it's going to feel tacked on and unnecessary. But that's my thoughts on her as a character. I want to know yours though, because I don't think that Traveler deserves their own video, because yes, you could say they have so much lore hidden away, but it doesn't matter when in the game itself, they don't feel like a person, they feel like a caricature or a sketched outline of what one should be. I understand they have a backstory, but that's never conveyed to us. I understand they have a twin, but HoYoverse is so weird with how they choose to write anyone in the game, it doesn't matter at this point. We've never seen their relationship, so realistically by this stage in the story, it doesn't even matter that they're related, because I would just dip. The twin is such a minimal part in the game's overarching theme and story that it doesn't really feel like they matter as a person. But what are your thoughts? Do you like the Traveler? Do you like Paimon? If you do, tell me, but I think that she could have been done better. And yes, I refer to Paimon as she because I don't give a fuck.